architecture itself, I mean, can it sustain you through your whole career?
It's easy to spend other people's money, but when it's your own, you really make a choice about design.
This idea of building new towns, I mean, we did have that after the Second World War.
Yeah.
Isn't it about time we had some new thinking?
Hello, Architect Nation, and welcome back. Enoch Sears here, founding partner at Business of Architecture, and today I have a question for you. Have you ever felt frustrated that sometimes it seems the only way to make a living as an architect is to grind out fee proposals and pray that your clients pay on time? Today is another episode on the popular topic of architect as developer. I love this topic because it's truly the architect taking back the reins of control. What if this was a feasible way, a way to create wealth, unlock design freedom, and actually own what you build? Well, on today's conversation with Gus Zogolovitch and Amanda Baillieu, you'll discover the one mindset shift that turns overlooked gap sites into high profit opportunities in your development projects, why the riskiest part of development usually isn't the money, and how to overcome the real obstacle, how architect-led developments are quietly outperforming big house builders and changing the game in the United Kingdom. Today, Business of Architecture founding partner Rion Willard interviews Gus Zogolovitch and Amanda Baillieu, who are the co-authors of the book How to Be an Architect Developer, available through the RIBA bookstore. Amanda Baillieu is the founder of Archiboo, a UK-based events and awards platform. Gus Zogolovitch is a multi-award-winning developer who started in the property world over 20 years ago, running Solid Space with his famed father, Roger Zogolovitch, before setting up Unboxed Homes, London's first custom-build developer. And remember, stick around to the end of this conversation for special smart practice tools and resources.
Gus and Amanda, what a delight to finally have you both on the show, The Business of Architecture. How are you?
Good, thanks. Yeah.
All good, thank you.
Excellent. So a really interesting, unique duo you both are. Amanda, obviously, you've got a background in journalism previously, and founder of Archiboo, and a massive, influential guiding force of the architecture industry in the UK. And Gus, really innovative developments that you guys have been doing with numerous different businesses that you've been involved in. And you guys coming together and creating the Developer Collective, again, a very influential platform, if you like, that's really solving and promoting this idea of architect becoming developer, and kind of filling a very critical role in the industry is amazing. So welcome to the show. And I think let's jump in straight away. And how do you guys describe the Developer Collective, and how did it begin?
Right, we're going to have a problem here because we both like talking a lot. So we're going to have to be very careful in the way we split this up and don't interrupt each other. So, Gus, why don't you go first, and then I can come in.
Oh gosh, okay, that's put me on the spot, hasn't it? I think the best way to describe it is if we take ourselves back to about 2017. And Amanda and I just met up for a drink in the architect's haunt of St John's in Clerkenwell. And over a drink, we were just chatting, and I was mentioning that lots of architects were coming to me and saying, "Hey Gus, how do you get into development?" And I knew Amanda had been running Archiboo for a few years by then, and I said to her, "Look, I know you're in touch with lots of architects. Are you getting something similar?" And then I think from that moment on, we said, "Oh well, maybe we should sort of try something and put something on." And now I'll let Amanda take over from where we got to from there, because otherwise I'll talk too much.
We're both being very, very polite to each other at this moment in time. So I guess, exactly what Gus said. I mean, it was one of those things where you're having a conversation and you both go, "Oh yeah, no, I'm getting that as well." I think, so it's post-Brexit. I mean, whether that's relevant or not, but I just think everybody was up for doing like different stuff, really. And I think also there was a kind of nagging sense that, architecture was becoming quite difficult to make sort of money from over the course of your career. That's kind of what I was getting. Architects were struggling a bit, as they do at various times. As we know, architecture's sort of cyclical, and they were probably seeing that things were going down rather than up. And so it's like, how could they make a bit more money? And so I think all those things were happening, and Gus and I just went, well, let's try something. And yeah, I think we just kind of threw ourselves in the deep end a bit and rounded up people we knew, architects who'd done a bit of development, and some people in the industry who could talk about kind of finance and things. And we just put on a conference, and it sold out. And we thought, oh yeah, we were right. This is
Well, it doesn't surprise me, and I think here at BOA we know that every time I do, or Enoch or myself, we do a podcast to do with any kind of architect developer. Even if we did a podcast, I did a podcast every day of an architect who did some development in the US, and it was a disaster. And even that disaster show was so popular that it really kind of, it's interesting, the question, like, why is the idea of architect developer so attractive to so many architects? Is it purely because they're not making enough money in the traditional practice? Is it because there is a massive opportunity just design wise that in terms of architectural mission and getting more houses built, for example, that being a developer is actually more a better way to facilitate that? Or is there something else, or is it a mix of all of that?
Well, I mean, Gus has probably got his own views. I mean, it's a mix, isn't it? It's obviously not just the money. So it's that thing of, wanting to be able to do a development and feel more in control. And, I think whether that's something that, we felt very much when we started Developer Collective in 2017, I think it's been going on for some time, is that architects, they come out of college, they've done a long training, they join a big practice in London or elsewhere, and they're a bit of a cog in a machine, and they're not really getting involved in building. And a lot of them, that's what made them want to become architects in the first place, I suppose, is they love that idea of, they like construction. So there's that element, definitely. I mean, maybe Gus wants to talk about, some of the other motivations.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because my father, Roger Zogolovitch, he was one of the sort of first, I suppose, architect developers in the UK. Anyway, he was at a certain point, the RIBA didn't allow initially architects to be developers, and I don't exactly know when it happened, but at some stage they sort of decided it was okay. Developers weren't so dirty after all. And I think my dad was like, well, he was frustrated about having visions that clients wouldn't sort of commit to. So it's a bit like put your money where your mouth is. But I think since then, so that's obviously a big reason. I think since then, some of the other people we've talked to see it as a really good complement to doing architecture. Architecture is great. It can pay the bills. You've got a regular cash flow, but it doesn't necessarily get you wealthy. And I mean, being an architect developer doesn't necessarily, get you very wealthy, but it allows you to build up decent chunks of money that in a way, if you think about it as the sort of, the mashed potato and the gravy, so, you've got the ongoing cash flow of your architecture business, and then the big developments that come along, and then once every 3, 4, 5 years bring big lumps of money into the practice that can make a kind of significant difference. So I think it's control with the attraction of money. Buildings and property development still remains one of those industries where it's actually, you can make money quite easily, unlike, I suppose, in tech, where a few companies make serious money, but there are lots of companies not making much money. It's quite hard make money off things. So that would be my second thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's this thing that has been going on for some time now, but it's architects looking for an alternative model to conventional practice. So, traditionally you'll get a practice directors, might go and teach for a couple of days or one day, or they, there's other things that they try and do, and not, I mean, obviously not teaching for the money, but for the connections, the conversations, the networking, where that might lead. And I think it's with development, it's obviously got the advantage of being better paid, but it's this idea that you're not reliant on a single source of income. I think has become very appealing. And I think that's what we felt, or we are feeling at the moment, particularly, is that architecture is just a bit risky. I mean, I'm not saying development isn't risky, but that we kind of know what the risks are. But architecture itself, I mean, can it sustain you through your whole career? So if you've got that, people call it a side hustle. I mean, I guess that's what it is for a lot of people. It is a side hustle, but it kind of makes more money than the architecture in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
And I think it's, building on what Amanda was saying, is I think actually being in control of your own destiny, I think is attractive. So a lot of architects, as you know, work in a big firm. Very, very, very sort of standard is, you work in a big firm and then you say, well, I've had enough of this, I'm going to set up on my own. And you might pick up a partner, a mate that's, you've either studied with or you're at the practice with. You then set up on your own. There might be two of you, it's very common, three of you. And you start off in an architectural practice, I've seen it time and time again, where you start off in residential extensions, then you go to, slightly bigger jobs, and bit by bit you might pitch for some work, and bit by bit you can kind of climb the ladder. But it's still very hard to make money, even if you are very well established and you've been doing it a long time. There are a lot of architectural firms that don't really make it past 10 to 15 people. And it's difficult to keep that coming in. So while you're then in a sense, you're in charge of your own destiny, you're still pitching for jobs, right? Whereas in development, if you go out and find a site, you're in charge. Once you've got that site, you make it work, you sell the thing, and then you're obviously you've got to make an attractive product, but you're much more in control. And I think that's attractive.
How do you guys suggest that architects kind of get started in development? Because it's such a popular idea, but then it can be perceived as like that the kind of barrier to entry can be quite high because it's based on money, and then if you've got a business that's not making enough money, then to get started becomes difficult, and the whole idea of using somebody else's money might just it might turn your brain inside out of just the amount of fear that's involved in that. How do you guys how does an architect begin? How can I kind of start chunking it down?
Just because I think when we were doing the book and we talked to a lot of architects who'd probably got going before 2008, the economic crash. And so at that time, you've got to remember that you could, your whole university education was free and rent was fairly cheap. And you could buy, I mean, you didn't have to be like super wealthy or anything or take big loans to buy something. And you could, as an architect, do it up over weekends and you knew what to do. And so I think for a lot of those, for that generation, that's how they got into it. So they had a little bit of, they had a bit of a nest egg from doing those refurbs at that time. And I think that's what quite a lot of the architect developers that we speak to have done. They've bought something, they've bought a site, they've developed it maybe over quite a long time, but they've picked a really good area. So, they've gone to like far east of London,
right?
And that bit of that bit of London has gone up, 20 times since they bought the land. So I think so they spot opportunities early on. That's one obvious way. So they have a bit of the cash, and then I think, if they can do that, they are released from that thing of having to go and borrow the money to buy the site and to do the build. So a lot of them can buy. I think it's fair to say, wouldn't you, Gus, that quite most of our architects, developers can buy their site. It's when they need to raise the money for the build that's obviously more complex.
So I suppose your question, just coming back to your question, which is, how do you get started in a sense? I'd have two or three answers to that. First of all, buy our book. That will help you get started. That's very cheap.
Brilliant book, well recommended. We'll put all the information into the
excellent
in the podcast.
Glad to hear it. And then of course come to one of our talks and be inspired and meet us there. But I suppose on a serious note, I think it's, you don't have to start with a development for a kind of 9-unit scheme in central London. Okay, you can buy a rundown property in an area that allows you to, that suits your budget. Okay, and then you use your skills to refurbish that, and then that gets you into the swing of development. I think development, bearing in mind, is taking something and adding your skills, as it were, to create a vision, which you then sell to a customer. Okay, and you can start small. And the Candy brothers started with their grandparents' flat, famously, and in Shepherd's Bush. Now, a flat in Shepherd's Bush is now quite a lot of money, but actually you could find the equivalent in Bristol or something, another town, or Manchester, or Leeds. You don't have to be in London. So I think that's the first thing. Auctions are still very popular and easy to sort of track, inexpensive things. You can, generally the kind of, people think the money might be the obstacle. Actually, it's the deal that's more important, because if you find a good deal where there's a good enough margin, then you will generally find money, whether it's through friends or family, or if you have to go to sort of third party. But Amanda's right. I mean that most of the architects who have done it sort of generally try and buy the site outright in cash, and then you borrow to actually do the redevelopment. But you can start small. You can start with a 1-bedroom flat and do from there.
But I think sorry, Gus, didn't mean to cut through you. But I think the other thing that we've been we're kind of getting the message through from the architects or architect developers is that there's a lot of people out there who would like to put their money into a development, but they haven't got the time and they haven't got the expertise, but they have got the money. So we were talking to a couple who did a talk for us recently, and we were talking about this very same thing. And he just said, "Oh, well, it's all on this. It's all on my phone. All the money is here. They're all my contacts." So it's basically, if you've got an opportunity, if you spotted an opportunity, and your friends know you're good at this stuff, you can get the money. I think the money is probably, we go on about finding the money and how hard it is, obviously. But I think sometimes we overdo the money, because actually there's a lot of money out there. You've just got to know. So that it goes back to that networking thing. You've got to know people who've got money.
That's interesting. And perhaps we can take a little step back here, actually, and identify what are some of the skills then that put architects into a good place to be able to be architect developers. And then what would you say are the skills that need to be either developed or that you see are not as mature as they need to be for being an architect developer, or there might be completely new skill sets?
They are, if you think about what an architect does, is that they're always, spotting sort of where the value is for clients, aren't they? That's famously kind of the old stories. The architect goes around with the developer and does the sketch on the back of the envelope and gives it to the developer, and the developer says, "Oh, thank you very much," and goes away and makes a lot of money. I mean, that's kind of, architects have that skill, but they're not making the money. So I guess, number one, they can spot an opportunity. But in terms of the kind of thing we're talking about, it's the small sites. We've always obviously been more focused on the small sites where there could be a lot of problems and issues that a conventional developer just doesn't want to take on. So the architect, particularly if they've got the income coming in from a practice, they can see how to unlock the value from that site, even though it could take a long time and the money won't be coming in very quickly. They can afford to do that. I mean, they've got other jobs bringing the money in, and so I suppose that's the kind of number one thing, is that they can see where the value is. They can unlock the value from these difficult sites with overlooking or whatever the issues are. So I think that's number one. And obviously there's things like understanding the planning system, understanding the planning in their local area.
Yeah, I mean, I rather facetiously say, when you talk about what's the difference between a developer and architect, about 7 years training. And that's kind of the truth, is, there's no skill set to a developer except being a bit ballsy, and an architects who are prepared to sort of believe in themselves and sort of see, they can make it work. I think you asked also what's the thing that they may need to work on, and it is probably only about confidence around money. Okay, it's like confidence about getting on the phone to people and saying, "Hey, I've got this great opportunity. Do you want to, do you want in? Do you and being able to deal with investors?" I think, and maybe being a little bit, and obviously they have to be commercial. So when they have to think very carefully about when they are specifying for development, for their own homes, or for their own development. I mean, making sure they're not designing it for a client, bearing in mind that every decision they make has an impact on the bottom line. And I think it creates a really good rigor around the architecture of architect developers, because it's easy to spend other people's money, but when it's your own, you really make a choice about design, and what makes an impact to the bottom line. Is if I specify this tile, from Morocco, which is a kind of hand kind of fired tile, versus one, a very nice one from some other local manufacturer in the UK, am I going to get the return by tripling the money amount I have to spend on a tile?
There's those number of skills that an architect can be sort of looking at. They're well suited in terms of, I like this idea that the architect is very propositional. Like there's a kind of asset that an architect has of being able to find an opportunity and exploit it. And that's part of that 7 years of training, is to go and look at those horrible, ugly sites and imagine something that can happen there. So that's quite entrepreneurial in and of itself, and then actually being able to link people to it. And I think that's what's quite nice about what you're saying, is that if it's a deal, if it's a good site, if there's something that's possible there, then actually getting money really isn't as daunting as it might appear, and a bit of just being ballsy and going out and asking for it actually is one of the major steps forward. Do you see architects doing other things, like say they might find a site and then they might bring it to a developer, and then they might put some of their their work, let's say they haven't got much cash themselves, but they just put sweat equity into a project and then partner up with a developer? Is that a good strategy that you see people do?
Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of ways that they can do it. I mean, that is one model. More with builders and with developers. I think we've seen that a lot. a few times. And then obviously architects putting their money together, if they haven't got it all in cash, getting together with maybe another couple. We know examples of that. Maybe they're the sort of silent partners and the architects are putting some money in, but they're also putting sweat equity in. So there's some fees coming in at the same time. There's all kinds of ways of doing it. There's no kind of, magic bullet really. And I think that's what's interesting when we're doing the talks is that kind of every talk we have, these are the talks we run in London with architect developers, and now we're talking to small design-led developers as well. But they always say, "Oh yeah, this is how we've made it work," because it's kind of who's around and who wants to come along for the ride. Like so many, it's like a kind of doing a business, isn't it? It's like, yeah, that sounds great. I really like this idea. I think that's why it's a kind of difficult thing to teach. Because
I think that's right. I think there are lots and lots of ways to skin the cat, as they say, and that's going to depend who you've got in your black book and who you can network with. It all starts with the opportunity, though, and I think that's what hopefully, if there's one thing that your listeners take away from this is, if you see an opportunity, go and talk to the owner and try and find the owner and try and get it. And you don't have to pay money up front, because if you can convince them, you can either work for the owner. We've seen examples where architects pitch to the owner and then effectively get in that way, and then they're under a sort of what's called a promoter agreement. You can get an option on the site and effectively pay a small amount of money, and then you don't have to find the money up front for that site, but you can maybe put your time in to get it through planning, maybe put a little bit of money in, and all of those things are fantastic ways to get going without very much money at all. So you definitely don't need a lot of money to get started. Obviously, I'm not saying that doesn't help. It does help, but you don't need it. It's not a prerequisite. The prerequisite is the opportunity that stacks up. And I think is making sure that you do your numbers, because it's all, the old expression is, you've got to buy well on your way in, because once you do that, everything else falls into place.
Yeah, it was very interesting, actually. I had somebody on the podcast a few weeks back who was talking about their own experience doing development. And it was an interesting case study, because it was a case study of it going wrong. Or it didn't go wrong necessarily. It just they lost money, but they were kind of thinking long term, and they were like, you know what, that couple of $100,000 that we've lost we're going to make that back on the next project. But it was very much that point that you were making there, that they got overly excited, paid way too much at the beginning, and then they were never able to recoup the money no matter what was happening. And then COVID happened, and then there was just more and more challenges that kind of kept piling on. But that initial finding the opportunity, and these sorts of unloved little gap sites that the cities are filled with, those really are, we're seeing so many good examples of this happening now, with design-led architects, the design-led developers and architect-led developers doing that. I think it's very encouraging.
I think auctions are full of sites that have come unstuck because the person doing it has gone bust. We've only really written about the people who are successful, but as you've just said, there's loads of people who aren't successful. I'm not saying they're architects, but it is. I think we've just been saying, oh, you can get the money, and it's kind of, you don't need a lot of money, but we're not really. It would be wrong of us not to say it's also hugely risky, because there are those things which I'm sure you'll probably come onto, but there are those things that kind of come out of the blue, like a war or interest rates, or kind of Trump. Things that kind of upend the economy, like which you kind of take everybody by surprise, and suddenly that loan is a lot more expensive, and and or materials suddenly go up massively. So all your numbers are, I mean, all your numbers are wrong, and then you
Yeah,
have
I
to
think
start. So it's quite
there's
risky.
there's that old expression, it's only when the tide goes out you see who's swimming naked, right? So at the moment, the I think the tide, the tide prior to sort of 2018 was just going up and up and up. Okay, so if you made mistakes, you were going to get saved by the market. Okay, but now the tide is basically staying still. So, if you don't do your numbers right, you will not get saved by the rising sale price of houses. This is mostly London I'm talking about now. I mean, I think there has been some movement outside of London, but very much in London, I think prices have been static in nominal terms and arguably in real terms falling for a number of years now. And you've got build costs rising and your money costs rising. All of those things put a lot of pressure on the appraisal, because in development, for those who don't know, it works in reverse. So the land price is generally not a fixed price. It's a measure of your total sales receipts, GDV in the lingo, gross development value, minus all your costs, minus your profit, or your expected profit, your desired profit, and that's the land. That's the value of the land. And you can imagine that if you get your sales, you're a bit ambitious on sales and you underestimate your costs, your profit suddenly shrinks, and that's where you get in trouble. And that's why it's really important to have a healthy profit margin, not because necessarily you want to be super greedy, but because you need that as a sort of a contingency. And we know developers who have, for very good reasons, tried to keep their profit margin low to sort of give back to the community, but then come unstuck because effectively, things have not gone quite right. So, so again, if you've bought well, you've reduced your costs. That's a big opportunity to sort of save money. But we do think as architects, you've still got a fantastic opportunity to sort of spot things that other developers don't. And I think that's a key takeaway, is that you might spot bits of land that are unloved, that don't sell at auction, right? Because everyone's like, oh God, that's too complicated. And that's happened a lot. A lot of people we know bought stuff that didn't sell at auction and then turned it around because they could assess the risk themselves. And then you've managed to buy at a good price. And then you can either then sell with planning if you want, or you build it out. You've got that option.
Have you found that the kind of work that you've been doing with architects, where you're kind of empowering them to become developers, that other developers have actually started turning around and being like, hold on a minute, there's a kind of like superpowers happening over here, and that it's changed, that part of the industry, or it's kind of given a kind of another level of creativity for developers, because they're starting to see opportunities that are being unlocked where they might have thought weren't possible before?
I mean, I wish. I wish we were having that much impact. I mean, it's really hard, isn't it, with I think with the smaller developers. I mean, we are beginning to find more, we're beginning to come across more design-led developers.
Yeah.
Not architects, they are developers. And we are inviting some of them to come and talk. And I think the reason for that, I hope the reason for that, is because there is a demand for more design-led development, particularly in London, but also in major cities like Manchester and Birmingham, that there are people who want to live in new developments with great architecture, or in lofts, that have been refurbished in a contemporary way. And I think that's just what's happening. And I think, this kind of comes round to that question of, all these kind of new homes that are going to be built, we're told, in this country, in the UK. I mean, what kind of homes are we actually going to be building? Because I think what we hear, and I know we're in kind of central London, but people want to live in contemporary design. That's what, those things that kind of light and quality of light and space, these are all important things. And I mean, this is a bit off topic, but I guess it's central to what we believe we're trying to do, is say, actually, these small developers can really up the quality of what's built, because the quality of what's built here is pretty low. That's being polite. So obviously, if an architect is doing it, I mean, the quality is going to be so much higher. But I think, to your question about the design-led developers, I think there are more of them, or we are noticing more of them, and they're building companies that are not like traditional developers. They're only doing, maybe 20, 30. I mean, they're not doing massive amounts because they take time and planning, and but there's demand. They're doing well.
Yeah, I think I agree with Amanda. I mean, I think I like to think of I like to look at other industries in general because I'm interested in business as a sort of concept. And you look at the likes of something like of Brewdog, right? A very small company. I don't know, 7, 8, 9 years ago. It was probably, I think it was operating one place, one microbrewery. I can't remember wherever it started. And now look at them. They got it. They're everywhere. And craft beer as well is everywhere. It's like literally you can't walk down a kind of a trendy high street without 4 microbreweries. Tripping over yourself to get to. And I think, but that takes time. And we're talking about, and that's beer, right? It doesn't take very long to kind of manufacture and distribute and drink and order another one. Housing takes a long time to do that. So I think there's definitely an increasing level of awareness and of design-led housing, and places like the Modern House do fantastically well to help get that message out. But there are still a very, very small number of design-led developers. But each year they grow because they realise that customers realise they don't have to live in a drafty Victorian house, or if they are going to live in that, it could be one that's really nicely fitted out and beautifully done, and so they don't necessarily want to do the work. So that's where developer or entrepreneurial architects step in and say, well, actually, I'll make this really amazing and do the fantastic extension and the great loft conversion, not the boring stuff, but the kind of really interesting stuff, because people want to express who they are. They want to be individuals. They want to, we have that in every other walk of life, right? You can express yourself through your clothing, your art, your literature, your photos, all of this sort of stuff. But housing is quite generic, but so we're very much on the edges, but it's absolutely in my mind clear that it just gets bigger and bigger as more people get into it and more people say, oh, it's possible. Because until something becomes possible, people go, okay, well, I'm not going to find a nice looking place in the area I want to be, and so don't worry about it. But I think what's interesting in a way, in the way people are buying houses, is not just, it's sort of making I think the Modern House have made people think maybe it isn't all about location. I think generally people in the past have gone, right, okay, well, I'm living in, for sake of argument, one area of London. I'm going to look within sort of half a mile of where I live, and that's it. But with the advent of these kind of amazing houses coming along, I think people are making big moves, not necessarily knowing what the other area is like, but just saying, oh, wow, that's an amazing house, I want to move there. So this idea of sort of location is interesting, because I think that's slightly shifting in people's sort of mindsets.
I know it's very encouraging as well, and kind of starts to paint a positive picture of the value of what an architect and what design can bring to properties. And certainly in the UK, the sort of level, what people have tolerated has been pretty low for a very long time, and it's an exciting development to consider that actually people really want interesting buildings and something that's unique, and that there's a market for it, and developers are starting to see that, and designers at the forefront of it.
Yeah, definitely.
With your book, the projects the case studies that you included in there, how did you come about those particular projects to show? And
Well, I think we knew we had to go away and find 20, 25 architect developers. I mean that, and with doing any book, I mean the publishers will always want a smattering of international names as well. Can't all be UK. So we did a bit of I mean, we obviously knew quite a few of them personally, but we did a bit of a call out using social media and found a few that way. But mainly they came through our kind of network of people we knew who'd done development. I mean, starting kind of, I guess, with, I mean, we didn't include Gus's father because he's fully a developer now, but we could have done, I guess. But George Ferguson, who was president of the RIBA, bought a building kind of way back when, a warehouse in Bristol, and kind of saved that building from being demolished. But George never really calls himself a developer. He just said, I wanted to save this building and fill it with interesting things. So I guess, so George at one end, right up to an architect who bought a site during lockdown or during COVID and did two houses on the site with a friend, one of whom was not in the UK. So various stories that we knew about, and we wanted to include them in the book. I think the only rule we had, and this is probably important in the sense that we weren't really interested in architects who'd just done one house for themselves, because that model is really familiar. I mean, architects have always, done their own homes, and there's books about that, and some of them are fascinating. But we really wanted architects who set out to do a development and make some money and maybe go again, or we're looking for land. So that's kind of, if you like.
So all of them were from like a commercial perspective as opposed to their own home.
Yeah. Oh, definitely.
Yeah,
yes, exactly.
Certainly, it needed, in our mind, it had to be sellable. It had to be made as a sort of, because it's only when you put your product in front of the market that you really find out whether what you've done is good or bad, and I think you've got to put yourself out there to really call yourself a developer, and so that was one of our criteria, really.
Yeah, but they weren't necessarily doing the development, marketing it, selling it, going on to the next, because they were running a practice at the same time. So, they might be buying a couple of buildings, doing them up over a period of time, having some interesting creative uses for those buildings, the existing buildings, then knocking that down when they could and building something else, or retaining the building, all kinds of, so not traditional development journey, if you like, but that's fine, because at the end of the day they were unlocking value in that site, and they were taking risk, and they were raising the money, and using their skills as architects. And so they were definitely past our test of what made an architect developer.
And with the developer collective itself, and perhaps this is specifically a question for Gus, your own background in development, have you found like that actually kind of providing this education and courses has meant that your network has now increased quite dramatically, and that there is lots of opportunity for new types of collaboration with your own organization and architects?
I mean, in all honesty, my network's increased a little bit, but that's not why I set out to do this. In all honesty, it's more, I did development with a very clear idea that housing is crap in this country on the whole, and I thought, I've got the ability to kind of have quite a small impact because I can only build so many projects over the course of my lifetime. And I don't really have a desire to massively scale up and get lots of investor money in, because that can dilute what you're trying to do. So really, this was an opportunity to think, is almost a kind of good pyramid scheme. I'm thinking, if I can do however many decent developments, but if I can help and educate and set people on the right path to them to do it the same, then great. So thinking of it more around the sort of mentorship model, and rather than as a sort of opportunity for me to kind of have collaborations. I mean, I'm always open to collaborations, but my main motive is that really it's a sort of giving back to the community, creating a kind of ecosystem around design-led development. And I've always thought architects make brilliant developers because they're so, I suppose they've got the incentive, the kind of intrinsic motivation to do something good. Whereas I suppose developers who come at development with purely a profit motive tend to cut corners wherever they can. I've seen it time and time again and met many of them. And I just don't sort of find those people like-minded. I don't really want to, I don't really want to encourage more poorly built, expensive housing. I'm looking for, and I find that architects tend to make very good developers because they also have this, I suppose, in intrinsic motivation to do something good. So that's really why I'm coming at it. So rather than as a sort of networking thing. But of course, it's great meeting all these people, and I really enjoy it. So it's a fun night out when we do the talks or the drinks or whatever it is we do. And I think Amanda and I we're quite, in a way, we just go for it, and it's quite nice. We're not, when we don't worry too much because we haven't got investors or anything like that. We just try stuff, and if it works and our audience like it, we go, great, well, let's do it again. And that's sort of the way we sort of run Developer Collective. And I think we'll carry on doing it that way.
I love it. You mentioned earlier actually about how the RIBA, historically actually had prevented architects from being developers. And this is an interesting one because both the AIA and the RIBA have in the past been very averse to architects doing anything other than architecture, whether it's running contracting firms, even interior design to an extent, and certainly development. Why do you think that is? And do you think these institutions are changing their perspective? And is there any risks for architects in terms of becoming developers that go beyond the kind of the financial risk, and actually it's a risk to the profession in some way when they're stepping outside of their lane?
I mean, the RIBA, to give them their due, did invite us to run one of their conferences, which was all about being developers, being architect developers. So, and they published our book. So I think in that way they've been
given their blessing.
Yeah, they've given it encouragement. I mean, I guess. It's a professional body, isn't it, for architects? So we're a little bit off on the side as far as they're concerned. I mean, you can't sort of register as an architect developer. There isn't anywhere for an architect developer to go. I mean, I guess that's why we exist, because we are the only organisation in the UK that are kind of doing anything really for this quite small subset, I guess. But I mean, I suppose my kind of view on this is that it's a bit of a broader view is, will the RIBA have to look more generally at how the profession is going to survive and what that means, and architects taking on different roles and what that does? I mean, it's part of a different conversation, but I think it's, when you look at the RIBA, over the time I've kind of known it, it's always been very much the architect in this camp and the developer
Yeah.
Let's get the developers in to talk to the architects about what they want, and the architects can put their case. And I think that's all a bit old school. I think it's got to be much more, architects coming forward and offering. I mean, not they don't have all the solutions by all means, but let's break down those silos a bit. So actually, an architect developer, you know what, it doesn't really matter. They're just as valued. They're just as valuable part of the mix. And I think it's a kind of question for the RIBA is how pure they want to keep it and why they need to keep it like that. I think the conversations in the RIBA and the kind of things that they do could be a little bit more interesting if they opened it up to this new world of having to be more entrepreneurial, I suppose is what it is.
I would agree with all of that. I suppose I think it's very hard for institutions, especially ones as venerable and as old as the RIBA, to change, because there's a lot of inertia to change, because it's the sort of the way they've always done it. I think they should change, because I think architect developer is a really valuable skill set, and actually they could offer, they should be offering this at university. They should be doing much more around education rather than just giving it over to me and Amanda to do that. And even if nothing else, I'm absolutely amazed that they don't teach just a course on development appraisal, in every standard architecture school. Even if they don't want to be an architect developer, they're going to be dealing with developer clients, a lot of them. And, they ought to know how that developer thinks and how it works and how their business model is, because the more you understand your client, the better you can be servicing their needs. I mean, likewise, I think they should be doing they should all be doing a work study on a building site, so they know that, drawing a line is all well and good, but how is that line going to be built and supported and screwed in? And, and I think, and that's where I think architecture should be teaching the sort of the realities of life outside, if you like, the life outside the drawing board. Yeah.
I mean, that gets onto that whole, question of what architects are learning, during their long training. I mean, obviously, again, it's a sort of big question, particularly post Grenfell, that architects were criticised for not knowing actually how a building is put together, and do they have? I mean, education has always been a bit of a complex subject, let's put it like that. But I think going back to the thing about the RIBA and sort of how much should all this stuff that we've been talking about be taken on board and integrated more into how an architect thinks and what they. And why aren't people, rushing into their practice and saying, hey, I've seen this bit of land, I really think we should get going on this. I mean, we all know architects' jobs are very complex and probably more complex in terms of the regulations and stuff, the red tape, if you like, that they have to sort of get through. And I think they all say we just don't have the headspace to be able to think about doing anything else but getting this building up and through planning and all the other things that hit them. But I think politically, there's probably more. There's a kind of growing recognition of the importance of small sites as part of the mix.
Yeah,
and I think that's why necessary. I mean, I don't mean the RIBA needs to take more notice of it, because again, they've got their role, and arguably that's not one of them. But I think that it's somehow it's important. Small sites are important, and what you put on them is important, and architects are part of the mix. But that conversation at the level we'd like it to be happening isn't happening, because it's all the big house builders and where's the £1 billion going to come from and how are we going to, streamline planning so it can all happen. Meanwhile, there's, if you just think about the number of empty homes or, buildings that are not in use. I mean, if there's like enough to fulfill the whole target for the first year of 330,000 homes we're meant to be building a year. I think there's 250,000 empty buildings. So you could just kind of look at that, but that doesn't get done. That I think that's the frustration, is we feel sometimes like we're doing this stuff. There's lots of people saying it's great. It's a really interesting conversations and lots of enthusiasm, but it needs to get noticed at a much bigger scale. Somebody needs to go, yeah, actually, we could get something going on this. If everybody put their small sites.
Do you mean politically, or like with
it has to
other
be
institutions, or within the government?
Within government, really. I mean, it's everybody knows that local authorities have lots of land, and some of them are doing something about it very slowly. But if there was much more of a kind of national effort to get all these small sites into some kind of shape, and get local builders teaming up with local architects, however you do it, just to get the thing moving a bit faster. Because I think, the clock is ticking, sort of thing. I mean, they're going to 1.5 million homes is a lot of homes. So a bit of momentum would be nice, I think.
And I think, again, borrowing from other industries, I mean, I'm a big fan of innovation, huge fan of innovation. And I've had some experience in the fintech industry as well. And and there, that's regulated by the FCA, Financial Conduct Authority. And what they did, which I think is very clever, is they create what's called a sandbox, which is effectively saying, you're small, okay, it's okay, you don't have to kind of be within this regulation, which is 10,000 pages of regulation, whatever it is. Just get on with it, try and create something interesting that's of value to the customer, and then if there's traction, so we can kind of look at how we can bring that within the scope or whatever it is. Now, why the hell are we not doing that with planning, right? Why are we not saying, what, why are we just congesting the system by making it harder and harder and harder, and it's longer, it's more expensive, and all these sort of things? I've always thought while and we're in danger of sort of going on beyond developer collective, but I think it's relevant because this is where I think architects can help, because architects really could go out and identify bits of land that are unloved. Maybe we have to use powers of nationalization or compulsory purchase or whatever, just to, there are bits of land around me, and I'm in zone 2 in London. There are bits of land of me that I have known empty and sitting there unloved for as long as I've been here, and I've been here 15 years now, right? And I'm thinking, that is a prime opportunity, but it just sit here, a kind of derelict building, and you think, that's surely wrong. That you think, some clever architects, if you can kind of effectively get that back into the system, reduce the kind of planning load, get that through, rezone it, whatever it is, that can become housing. And that's what we need. If we're going to try and get these 1.5 million houses, we've got to try something different. What they say is, you keep trying the same thing, and you're only going to end up with the same result.
I think the figure I read the other day is that there are 38,000 long-term empty dwellings in London. Wow. And that's just London. That's not nationally. So, because everybody goes, oh, well, that's when you're talking about all these empty sites or empty properties, that's not London, because everything in London is owned and expensive. But there's 38,000 of them. So even that, even a kind of some action on that would be interesting and help.
And then I was going to say, and then you couple that with the fact that most people now are expecting planning to take them 18 months. That's 18 months of, and the cost of finance to a developer is, nigh on 10% a year, if not 15 or 20% a year, depending on where they get their money from. You think that is a lot of money sitting there. And the problem is the planning authorities don't have, they're like, we hear this time and time again that, something's got resolution to grant, or the officers are okay, but it misses a committee meeting and it misses another one. You've suddenly added 30-40 grand of costs to that site just because you haven't quite got it together or the committee hasn't got enough time, etc., etc. Who's going to end up paying that 30, 40 grand? Just comes straight onto the consumer. It makes it more expensive, or they have to cut quality. It's ridiculous. It just doesn't stack up. While we have an industry which is purely set up to buy land and sell land with planning, there's no value add to the community in that. That all just goes back to people who are prepared to take risks. That's an arbitrage opportunity. We need to get rid of that, and that value needs to come back to the people actually building stuff.
How do you see that happening? Is it something that architect developers can
I think,
be a force for?
I mean, I think it's, nothing's going to, it's not going to be a eureka moment and suddenly, somebody in government is going to go, hey, you know what, guys, architect developers, that's going to solve all our problems. No, I don't think it's going to be like that. But I think, sort of in my kind of Mystic Meg moment, I think there's going to be at some point in the next year, whatever, everybody's going to go, we really have got to look at this in a different way, this problem, because doing like the new, I know this is we're talking about the UK here rather than kind of stuff that might be so relevant for an American audience. But this idea of building new towns, I mean, we did have that after the Second World War. Yeah. Isn't it about time we had some new thinking? It's so like, let's go back to what we did really successfully however many years ago and try and repeat that. Well, that has never been repeated despite efforts by successive governments to do new towns, eco towns, whatever towns. It's never happened. So so why don't we just look at it all upside down and inside out and think about, this small sites thing, just letting small builders and architects and, more creatives have a go at this problem. But I don't think it's going to be somebody in Whitehall going, that those people on that podcast I was listening to about architect developers, but there will be, it will kind of play out. There will be more and more kind of questions asked, I hope, because the land is there. A lot of people always go, but they say, oh, yeah, that's really interesting what you're doing. But of course, there's no land. There's no land anymore, is there? It's all been kind of carved up. That's not true. There's always land. There's always sites.
Yeah, I mean, we spoke to someone recently who'd done a study just within Lewisham themselves and identified 30,000 possible new homes, right? And that's all just land sitting there. And that's just Lewisham. You think about that across London, across the UK, and this is about densifying or infill sites. So in my mind, the big thing that if I could be London mayor for a day, the big thing is I would say, right, let's take a slightly scraggly bit of London, right, and create a sandbox. So you don't need planning permission. You just need to, you maybe get an architect to do some really good zoning, and you create maybe a design code and say, crack on with it, go for it. And I'm a big fan as well. With my development hat on, I do a lot of around self build and custom build, and there are places in all over the world that do amazing things where people kind of build slightly crazy, and we've tried it over here in Graven Hill. But I'm all for it. I'm all for kind of putting the giving customers agency over their design with the hands of an architect. And I think actually you could it was a point where you needed to have a licensed builder, a builder was actually going to be the architect involved in your projects. You could easily enforce some rules where you have to have someone who takes responsibility. So, there is a huge potential role for architects because of the training, because of the professionalism, because they know what they're doing. To, you could say, you can almost build what you want as long as you have a licensed registered architect doing it.
Love it. I think on that optimistic message, I think that's a perfect place for us to conclude the conversation. Gus, Amanda, thank you so much for spending some time with me this afternoon and sharing a bit about Developer Collective and your mission. It's been really wonderful.
You're very welcome.
Thanks for having us.
And now here's today's Smart Practice Tooltip. Listen up, Architect Nation, while you're slaving away on that latest project that you undercharged on. There may be a 6-figure leak in your practice that nobody knows about. Your team's working smoothly, clients are happy, but your bank account doesn't match all the hard work that you're doing. That's why we developed the Smart Practice Revenue Capacity Planner tool to expose exactly where you may be hemorrhaging money and also show you how to capture the value you're already creating but not charging for, all in just 30 minutes. Get this Smart Practice tool 100% free by going to businessofArchitecture.com/capacity. Thank you to our recent listeners who left reviews for the podcast on iTunes. Your reviews help others find this podcast so that a rising tide can raise all boats. Thank you today to SEK Architect. To be acknowledged on this show, open up the podcast app on your iPhone, search for Business of Architecture, and after clicking on the show, scroll all the way to the bottom to leave a review. Today's episode of the Business of Architecture show is sponsored by the Smart Practice Method, the world's leading step-by-step solution for running an architectural practice. Go from chaos, overwhelm, and team headaches to calm, freedom, and exceptional financial reward. Because you see, it likely isn't your architecture skills that are holding you back. It's the business aspects of running a practice, managing projects and people, dealing with clients, contractors, and money. So if you're ready to quit feeling like a glorified administrator and get back to architecture again, go to smartpracticemethod.com to gain access to the free video showing you the proven, simple, and easy to implement Smart Practice Method that's revolutionizing firm management for firm owners and teams. Thank you for joining us today, and remember that the views expressed on this show by our guests do not represent those of the host, and we make no representation, promise, guarantee, pledge, warranty, contract, bond, or commitment except to help you conquer the world. Carpe diem.